it relates, certainly as it relates to policing. And I've only heard good things about your work, Dr. Nelson. And if you can, if you can work with Jacksonville, I think you can work anywhere. But I do want to commend you for your work here, and I look forward to your presentation. The Urban League, we as a family, we look forward to participating with you going forward. And if there's an opportunity for other urban leagues around Florida to become involved in some of your efforts, we would love to do that. So welcome to the program. Thank you, Dennis, as always, and the interns for your assistance and in this very important town hall. So again, good evening, and I look forward to the presentations. Thank you.
So Sophia, would you take it away?
Of course. Hello, everybody. I'm Sophia. I'm currently interning over the summer with the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice. I'm really glad to see everybody here tonight. I've been looking forward to this town hall. So we're very glad to have our speakers tonight, Dr. Tammy Hodo and Dr. Randy Nelson. So basically the agenda for tonight, we're going to have presentations. Each speaker will speak, and then we'll have time for questions. Yeah, and we're going to be discussing the pillars of policing tonight. So Jacqueline, you can go ahead and introduce our first speaker.
Good evening, my name is Jacqueline, and I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Dr. Nelson. He currently serves as the director of Bethune-Cookman University Criminal Justice Administration Graduate Program and Center for Law and Social Justice within the College of Liberal Arts. His academic and professional career have focused on developing and evaluating delinquency prevention strategies designed to address the problems negatively impacting disadvantaged communities. He has an extensive history of working with nonprofit, faith, and community-based social service organizations to develop and effectively achieve their goals. Through his work, he has been able to influence various evaluation projects throughout the state of Florida. He has been able to secure more than $6 million in state, federal, and private funding to address racial disparities within Florida's criminal, juvenile justice, education, and dependency health systems. He is also the founder of the Situational Environmental Circumstances mentoring model, which was designed to meet the unique educational, social, and emotional needs of high-risk Black males. He is a nationally recognized law enforcement training consultant in the areas of community policing and engagement strategies. He has authored more than 50 technical reports and research publications and presented at numerous state and national conferences on effective strategies to engage communities of color overall and within the group of Black males in particular. His work experience includes employment with the Florida Departments of Corrections and Juvenile Justice and the Florida Legislature. Please welcome Dr. Randy Nelson.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. The other part of this work is recognizing stalwarts like Dr. Danford, the work of Dr. Hodo and Dennis in terms of bringing these issues to the forefront. The climate now in America, not just in Florida, is just divisive. I mean, that's where we are. So it's either you're on my team or you're the devil. So those conversations, when it's either I win and you lose, or you win out, it leads us to where we are now. And whether Black, white, green or yellow, Jew or Gentile, rich or poor, Republican or Democrat, we all want a safe and nurturing environment to raise our family. We agree there. Now, we may disagree on how to get there, but that's where we agree, and that's usually where I start. Now, starting with policing. Policing is just like any other profession in America. It's made up of Americans, the good, the bad, and the ugly of America. The problem with policing is that when you have a gun and a badge and you can take life and liberty, you should be held to a higher standard. I don't think anybody will disagree with that. You should be held to a higher standard. That standard can't be Jesus Christ's standard, that you'll make no mistake, but there's difference between a mistake and a decision. Derek Chauvin taking the life, murdering George Floyd was a decision. That wasn't a mistake. So I think we have to be very particular, because I think when we talk about policing in America, it takes a special human being to be willing to sacrifice their life to run into buildings that people are shooting in instead of running out. It takes a special individual to do that work. I was in law enforcement maybe 3 or 4 years in the south side of St. Petersburg as a parole officer. I had a .357, handcuff, and a cell phone in a bag. That was in 1989. The cell phone is like this now. You can fit it in the palm of your hand. It's about evolving, and law enforcement has to evolve. The skills, the talents that it took to be a law enforcement officer 20, 30 years ago is different now. And the profession itself must recognize that. So while I hold them to a standard, just like I hold teachers to a standard, there are two professions that I give little to no room of error. That's law enforcement and teachers. Law enforcement, as I said before, they can take life and liberty under the guise of the law. Teachers, bad teachers can steal dreams, and sometimes that's just as deadly as a gun to communities and individuals for generations. So those two professions, I give little to no room for error, but I also recognize, as I said before, there's none among us that's perfect. But I do think we have to recognize that those two professions, those noble professions, take special individuals. And when law enforcement allow folk in, like Derek Chauvin, like some of the others, I think it tarnishes not only the badge and the oath, but it also further divides the trust, particularly in Black and brown communities. So I'm first to admit, at Bethune-Cookman University, I'm very intentional. I'm not trying to produce a police officer. I'm trying to produce the next sheriff, the next police chief, the next Nat Glover. Those are the things that we're trying to, very intentional about it. And it takes strong-minded individuals that are talented. And I think we have those individuals, and law enforcement needs that now more than ever before. So that's my spiel on law enforcement. The only people that benefits from distrust, fear, and ill will between law enforcement and community are bad police officers and individuals in those communities that benefit from the violence, the chaos that occur in our communities. Now, on the other side of that, I'll be the first to march in line when a law enforcement officer violates his oath of office, brutalize, take advantage of anybody that's in the community, particularly communities of color, since it tends to happen there more than others. But on the flip side of that, I'm equally as passionate about making sure that our communities, particularly communities of color, that they're just as passionate, willing to march, willing to stand for when individuals in our communities, when we have 2- and 3-year-old kids shot and killed in drive-by shooting, no one's seen anything. Or young men dying on the street, no one saw anything. So we can get rid of all the bad cops, the racist, sexist cops in America, and we'll still see the level of violence in some of our communities. We have to, it's not this or that, it's this and that. We have to address both. I was in Little Rock, Arkansas a month ago, coming in to do some law enforcement community engagement training. The night I got in, the young female officer picked me up from my hotel and was taking me to the training. And she said, well, there was a shooting there last night in the community center. A 2-year-old and a 4-year-old were shot in a drive-by shooting. I said, did they capture who did it? No, an individual killed, but the 2-year-old survived. The 3-year-old was in intensive care, and a 22-year-old was killed. And no one knew who did it. That is also a detriment to our community, because part of the problem is, if it's my child, I'll step up and I'll go to hell in a handbasket for it. But if someone else's child, I'm not going to get involved with. Those are conversations that we must have in communities. Holding law enforcement accountable when they violate, but also holding those in our community that have a total disregard for human life in our communities. We have to be vigilant about both, and I am. You know, some people they'll say, Dr. Nelson, you can't have both of those conversations. I said, yes, I can, both of those conversations. And the other part, I have a 13-year-old and a 20-year-old that I love more than life itself. And I go around the country training law enforcement. I still have an uneasiness and an uneasy spirit when they leave my house. In fact of the matter, that they're more likely to be killed by somebody that looks like them. But in the same token, those are my kids. And I would be derelict in my duty if I didn't. So I have that conversation with them. What to do, how to do when you are confronted by law enforcement. Is it fair? No, it's not fair. But I want them to make it home. And that's my thing to them. You're respectful because you're my child. I taught you to be respectful. But I don't know who you'll run up against out there. So I'm going to have that conversation. Now, I'll have that conversation in a manner that I don't want them to be fearful of law enforcement. Because part of that problem is that if you look at statistics, we call the law enforcement more. The rate of us calling police, particularly in our poor communities, where the rate and the level of violence is higher, we call the police the most. So can you imagine a feeling of a mother that needs to call the police for whatever reason, and she is fearful for calling the police, just as she's fearful about some of the things that's going on in the community? That level of fear and trauma should be upon no mother. And that's why I've devoted my life and whatever I have remaining in it to making sure that we be strategic and intentional about improving the relationship between law enforcement and community. That means doing some of the things that Sheriff Williams has done. Sheriff Williams have arrested more police officers. He probably doesn't go around bragging about it, talking about it for several reasons. But in terms of arrest of law enforcement professionals that work for the JSO, they've arrested more. They've hired more and they've arrested more. My issue is they have to do a better job of not letting them in the first place. It's easier to keep them out on the front end because the damage that they do once they're in, not only to the representation of the agency, but to the trust, however fragile it is, between the community and particularly communities of color. So whereas I do believe we have a lot of work to do, I must admit that Jacksonville, St. Petersburg, they're a lot more intentional about things that they'll get rid of officers for than I've seen in the past. That being said, there are a lot of officers that still need to go. Not only in Jacksonville, across this country. And the flip side of that is as well, I think, particularly in Black and brown communities, just as pastors and civic groups and organizations we want our students to be doctors, lawyers, teachers, absolutely. I agree. We need to have some chiefs of police, some sheriffs there as well. So we can't villainize and talk about law enforcement in our community and then expect our best and our brightest to go and want to do the work. So it has to be this and that, not this or that. Meaning we're going to get out the bad police officers and we're going to make sure talented individuals from our community are a part of that process of going in and changing it from the inside. That's the motto at Bethune-Cookman University. Enter to learn, depart to serve. And part of that service is going into professions like law enforcement, like politics, like teaching, professions that actually impact the lives of our communities and our students. And I think at the end of the day, everyone's better for it. Not just Black folk, not just brown folk, but everyone is better for it. We value the lives of those that are marginalized within our counties, cities, and communities. So that being said, I'm looking forward to the conversation, because I think that these are right conversations and the time is now for these conversations. But more importantly, what do we do after the conversation?
Thank you so much, Dr. Nelson. We're gonna have some time for questions now. So if anybody has any, they can unmute or put it in the chat and we can read it. And if there are no questions, we also, us interns, made some. So yeah, anybody can feel free to unmute at any time.
I'll step in here. This is sort of more related to your report, and specifically the pillar of building trust and legitimacy. So recently, like in Jacksonville, there's been a lot of news about Marsy's Law, which protects the personal information of victims of a crime. And the appeals court in Jacksonville ruled that officers qualify as victims in use of force cases. And Jacksonville Sheriff's Office took that even further and said that the court's interpretation applies not just to officers who are threatened or assaulted before a shooting, but also any officer involved in any police shooting. So in your eyes, is that detrimental to building trust and legitimacy, or a right that should be afforded to officers? And if not, what should we do about it?
Actually, that's an excellent question. And I think, kind of like I said, is this and that. I think of good officers that get into a shoot and the ramifications that come with that. Because I'm of the opinion that no one wakes up in the morning and say, I'm gonna go out and kill someone. And even with George Floyd, I think that Chauvin didn't wake up in the morning and say, I'm gonna go kill George Floyd today. But by the same token, allowing somebody like Derek Chauvin in the profession and then giving them protection, I think is what all of us would look at and say that that's not right. But I'm equally convicted about those that go into the profession for the right reason, right way, and have to do a shooting and not offer protection. So I think the protection isn't for folk like Derek Chauvin. The protection is having leaders in the profession that don't bring anybody like Derek Chauvin into the profession in the first place. So I don't think we take rights away from those folk that do it the right way. I think that we need to hold our leaders responsible for making sure who they bring in. You vouching for them, that's on you. So I think in that sense, the protections are not for the bad folk. The protections are for the good ones. But on the flip side of that, who's responsible for allowing the bad ones in? And I think once we have that conversation, I think it would alleviate some of the conversation based on the question that you asked, which I just in my spirit didn't sit right, that same protection that JSO was talking about would protect bad officers. So we just have to be vigilant about making sure that we get folk in the profession that are worthy of that profession and its high calling. Thanks for the question.
Sure. This is like sort of a follow-up that's really closely related to that. What would your thoughts on like officer Bill of Rights laws be then? That like, for example, give an officer a right to like wait 5 days or like have access to like a statement before they go before like a jury?
Yeah. See, I'm a little conflicted there because a normal suspect isn't afforded those rights. So whereas I do believe, as I said before, is a special place in heaven that somebody that can serve their community as a police officer and do it the right way, there's a special place in heaven for somebody that's willing to do that. And they should be afforded. My fear is giving someone in the minute of a tragic shooting or incident or something, I can understand folk being confused. But that's the same case with me as a citizen. If I'm protecting my family and someone breaks in and I do a shoot, I still have to give a take of what happened and tell what happened. That's the same thing that an officer has. So I'm a little more conflicted on that particular issue, because although I want to recognize and allot all the leeway for officers that risk their lives day in and day out and the trauma associated with that, there's still a level of accountability that is also upon individuals that are in similar situations, but they don't get the 5 days to give their story and all those. So I do think that needs to be reviewed and assessed.
Thank you.
We had a question in the chat. They were wondering where you've seen success in transforming law enforcement.
There have been places, and usually when it's in the places that it's successful, I've looked at some places in Charleston, South Carolina, had some success in places. Looked at Camden, New Jersey, Boston with its juvenile crime. Usually they're successful because there's a joint level of accountability and responsibility on behalf of the police and the community. And what typically happens is there'll be a change in the leadership. Officer retire or chief retire, someone else comes in. So usually where there's a commitment between both the leadership and the community, that's where you usually see more successful programs. But what I haven't seen is it being sustained even when the charismatic leadership leaves, or even when community demographics change. I think where it's not a part of the fabric of the work, but it's because of individuals or community, and then those things change, then you typically don't see it sustained. But most times when there's a deliberate collaborative effort between both, meaning that the communities are responsible and accountable, and law enforcement, they're working together towards a common end, they're usually successful in small pockets and areas, but in terms of citywide or countywide, you don't see that as much.
Thank you.
Another question from the chat based on your report. In your report, you mentioned how law enforcement agencies should strive to create a workforce that contains a broad range of diversity. How can law enforcement recruit individuals from the community that represent diverse perspectives when many of those individuals have been alienated by the police?
You'll be surprised, because even if you go to JSO and the training that I've done, so we probably trained about 600 officers in JSO. And many of the Black officers that were JSO will come up after training that I grew up in Zone 5, I grew up in Zone 4. And that I'm here because I met an officer that represented what I thought it was like to be a law enforcement. Or I'm in it because I wanted to help my community. I saw what some of the drugs were doing right. So you'll have that. I think now it is also true that if I were to talk to my 13-year-old, my 20-year-old about being police, they would look at me with a jaundiced eye. So I think, once again, it starts with the community recognizing that policing, good policing, should be afforded to all communities. Policing isn't something you do to a community, it's something you do with. And even when you get into conversation about defunding the police and all those conversations, I've yet to go into a community, and usually I'm from, like I said, from Bakersfield, California to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. When I'm in with my jeans and tennis shoes and I'm actually in the community that see the high level of crime and all, I've yet to hear any one of them talk about defunding the police. What I've heard them say is they want good police, but never do. And usually when I hear the defunding, it's usually politicals or intellectuals. I mean, that sounds good. But what I hear people in the community talk about is we want good police. We don't want any bad police. The same thing that anybody, black, white, green, what you want for your family, that's what I want. And whatever policing that you get on the rich side of town, I want the same thing here. So whether it's not stopping me because you're in the black community and I'm black and I fit every description you have, all of those things go into it. But I do think that there's a place for policing. But once again, it's good policing.
Thank you so much. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hodo. She earned her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in Urban Studies with a minor in sociology, in which she specializes in race, class, gender, and ethnicity. She worked in academia for over 18 years in a variety of positions, including faculty and as university administrator. Tammy continues to be active in academia as she writes academic articles relevant to experiences of minorities in America. Her most recent publications include 2 chapters in an academic textbook entitled African American Families, Research, Theory, and Practice. Her contributions to the book were the chapters on the urban experiences of African American families and theoretical and methodological issues of studying the African American family. She recently signed a new book deal with Routledge to co-author Having the Hard Conversations on Race, Ethnicity, Politics, and Social Justice in Workplace and Educational Settings with some of her colleagues. She's the owner of All Things Diverse, LLC, an educational consulting company. Tammy has provided training to local and national organizations, all under the umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion. She's written course content on implicit biases and microaggressions for a national educational vendor that is being used at hundreds of colleges and universities. She is a TEDx speaker. Her talk is entitled The Social Implications of Race, and she's originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and is a service-connected disabled veteran of the U.S. Navy. With that, this is Dr. Hodo.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I will have to say that Dr. Nelson and I have a lot of similarities. So I was a probation officer for the state of Georgia, as well as Oklahoma, back in the early 90s, where we still had pagers. So, and very much relied on the police to support me as I did that. And actually, I focused on juveniles. So I dealt with the juvenile offenders who had been adjudicated. And I believe that policing is very important, but I too believe that we need to, police officers are indeed special in the regard that they have to have a special skill set. I don't think that necessarily the academy teaches them that. I think that you have to have the personality for that. I also think that this is not a zero-sum game, but I see it often perceived that way in regards to policing in minority communities. I see a lot of issues surrounding control. I see a lack of understanding of different cultures, which we talk about ethnocentrism, judging other cultures based on the culture of looking at it through our cultural lens. I know that there is a direct correlation between social economic status and that social construct of race. And that creates a lot of oversimplified generalizations made about Black and brown bodies in America. I am fully aware that African-American men have very much been perceived and depicted as criminals. And we see our brown brothers and sisters are often depicted as being illegal, which is interesting to me because we are all on stolen land. So that's a whole nother conversation about being illegal on stolen land. But anyway, again, I'm from Wisconsin, so lots of Native Americans. So Dr. Nelson also spoke about the talk. I have an 18-year-old African-American son who is a sophomore at Florida State University, and we also had to have the talk. And this is something that is really sad. And in full disclosure, I am biracial, and my parents did not have that talk with us. My parents married in '62, which down here would have been illegal. My father would have been lynched, but they were married in Wisconsin. And, you know, I'm just amazed at I guess what I perceive to see the continued disparities in policing within certain communities and the lack of people understanding that or recognizing it. I think that with the murder of George Floyd and the pandemic, that created the perfect storm, and where people were at a stagnant spot and they had to pay attention, and they saw the video, what I think a lot of people in the minority community have known for some time. I think that to get respect, you have to give respect, and that it's a reciprocal relationship. I believe that policing is very important. I think that police are here to protect and serve, but they need to protect and serve all the same. When I look as an urban sociologist, I know when gentrification is taking place, because then I begin to see police officers walk the beat in that neighborhood, where when it was a low income neighborhood, I didn't see that. Too often I see police come into low income neighborhoods solely for arresting people, but not to come and have actual community policing in regards to walking the beat, getting to know people. In Jacksonville, we have 6 zones, and I know that we have zone commanders, and we do have areas where they actually do that and they're actively engaged in the community. And I think that's imperative because, again, it's based on respect, and that's got to be a reciprocal relationship that has to be developed. I think that you need to have police in areas at the substations for a substantial amount of time for them, in order for them to create that social capital and that trust in that community. When you come into a community and you don't have that, and you're just barking orders and you're yelling, oftentimes people are not going to be very receptive because of that, the connotation and the conversation. And so if we look intentionally, right, at Duval, Jacksonville, there's something the census, US Census tracks, it's called the Index of Dissimilarity. And we sit at a 56, and it goes from 1 to 100. And what that means is, sitting at a 56 is that we would need 23% of African Americans to move to a predominantly European American community, or vice versa, in order to make this city truly integrated. So we have an issue with segregation in this city. And with that segregation comes the issue of people coming into police communities that they are not familiar with, that they do not have any cultural knowledge of. And reality is that, we are, again, very hyper segregated, and we see children going to schools now that are more segregated than we attended. And we have a lot of issues that we need to fix. I'm prior military. I will tell you one thing that the military is very good about doing is that they check your body quite frequently to see if you have any tattoos or any white supremacy, tattoos, if you have anything hanging up in your barracks that is related to white supremacy or any type of extremist. And we don't see that take place with police officers. I think that the training is, it has to be very intentional. It has to be very much relevant to culture. I think that we have to acknowledge that everyone has bias, and that shows up in policing, because one of the major units of socialization is the media. And again, the depiction of the African-American male is very criminal. My son, again, we have the 360 app, Life 360, and we've had that talk with him, but we have the Life 360 app because we don't know who he's going to engage with. And while we've taught him to be respectful and all these great things, I don't know, who he's going to engage with. Is it going to be, someone who means him harm just based solely on the complexion of his skin and all the derogatory stereotypes that tend to be associated with it? I do think defunding the police, and when I talk about defunding the police, I think we need to move some money. So I will say in Jacksonville, we only have 1 co-responder, and that's very problematic to me. I think each zone should have a minimum of 3 co-responders, 1 for each shift. And a co-responder is a mental health professional that goes out when they get a call that's based on mental health. I don't think that police, we've given them too much responsibility. And it's not a shame on them. To me, it's a shame on us, just like with educators. They're nurses, they're social workers, they're teachers. Police are trained to protect and serve. They don't have the skill set to handle mental health issues, not to the level that they need to be able to de-escalate and to assist those people. And again, in Jacksonville, we have one co-responder, but we have 6 homes. So I think that, you know, we need to focus on training in regards to mental health and have co-responders. When I say defund, that's what I mean, move more money to that program. Because as we've done these Safer Together meetings, we know that the county jail is one of the biggest housing units of people with mental health issues. And so we need to address that. And we saw in Rochester, New York, where we had the gentleman who had a bag put on his head, and he was in mental distress as he was in the snow and he died. So it's imperative that we do some type of training and talk about implicit bias, work with integrating our communities better, and just addressing a lot of the issues that we continue to see, you know, and just try, we have to figure something out. So one of my favorite quotes is either we can learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we can perish together as fools. And that's by Martin Luther King. And I'm very afraid that that's what's going to happen, because people have become so defensive and they don't want to have these really candid conversations. But we do know there is an over-policing problem in minority, low-income communities. You know, we had issues here with jaywalking while Black, you know, in low-income communities that didn't have sidewalks. You know, and it's just like, we have to have a more diverse police force. We need to have people who actually live in the communities that they're policing, would be something that would be nice as well as being culturally competent in their training and engaging with people outside of their communities. So with that, I would love to take any questions that I have.
Thank you for that, Dr. Hodo. So anybody can feel free to ask any questions that you have for Dr. Hodo, or any questions that you might have thought of for Dr. Nelson after hearing what Dr. Hodo had to say.
This is Deborah Thompson from the Jacksonville community. I would like to know what our next steps are and how anyone as an individual, a part of a community and a part of several organizations, can get involved and to make sure that we attack this from all fronts.
Well, we as a community really need to be willing to have these conversations, you know, in regards to what we want policing to look like. And we need to have those conversations with JSO. So we've been having conversations with Safer Together once a month, and we have had some community members engaged. And I think that's what it's going to take. It's going to take the community to be actively engaged in talking about what they envision policing looking like. You know, because if we don't have those conversations, we're not going to fix this. So that's what I think, is that the community needs to be actively engaged in these conversations.
Dr. Hodo, I'm a part of the Jacksonville branch of the NAACP, and we've met on a continuous basis with the Sheriff's Department and the Police Department back in 2020 on several occasions with local ministers to try and look at the mental health first aid piece that was in place in the city of Jacksonville and the mental health training that was going on at the local police department. And we did have several meetings. We met down at the police department. They met with us in the community. We even had an open forum at the FCCJ one evening. And we're still right here. I mean, it's almost as if nothing happened. Nobody went to the next step. So that's why I asked you for next steps. We have to be very vigilant in monitoring, tracking, and reporting on what's happening once we put things in place. And I think that's where we fail. When the funding ends, we end. And we cannot be jerked around by just the funding.
And Ms. Thompson, I totally agree with you. And with our report, we did come out with some recommendations. We talked about implicit bias mitigation training, crisis communication. One thing I will say that I'm finding, and I am not from Jacksonville, is that we have a lot of reports done that kind of sit on a shelf and they're not being implemented. right? So this was like a very rigorous process that we went through for 6 months, you know, and we made these recommendations, and I'm hoping, you know, and that's all I can do, right, is hope and present what I have, that we actually do get to these recommendations. We talked about having more co-responders. We talked about, you know, the mental health awareness. We talked about additional training. We talked about having a citizen review board, you know, so these are all conversations that we've had. And I'm just really hopeful that the city is willing to take it to the next level, because we know, again, like you said, you know, in full transparency, oftentimes things are done or written, but nothing is taking place, and it does indeed need to take place. And it seems like we come every couple of years and have the same conversation.
We do, you know, that, and that just
yes.
Like voters' right. I mean, why is it still an act and not an amendment to the Constitution? Why is voters' civil rights still something that has to be voted on every 20 years? So we're not watching, and we're not reporting, and the people do not understand. So I think as long as we have forums like this, and the individuals that are affected the most are the individuals that may be causing the problem in a lot of problems. They don't know they're causing the problem. They're just trying to live. People are in survival mode in most places. I came from Mobile, Alabama, went to Rochester in Minnesota, graduated from the University of Minnesota, and worked right down the street from where Wells Fargo was burned down when George Floyd was killed. So I still have family there. We took our urban renewal money and moved from Mobile, Alabama to Rochester, Minnesota. Now go figure, because IBM was recruiting at that time for Blacks to become a part of their corporate environment. And they moved them all over the country. And then 20 years later, because they had learned that society, they didn't know what to do with themselves, Black or white, once IBM changed this model of doing business. But we all have to adjust and move forward. I came to Jacksonville, and I've worked in this community on every side, low income and high income. And the disparities that I see when I first came here, my car stopped on 45th and Moncrief in the flood when it started raining. And it still could probably do that right now, because we have never been annexed into the total funding environment that puts replacement housing and sewer and water into this community. So I think that some of the things that we've allowed to go on for years and years have now come to haunt us, and we need to make sure, because every year it comes up with something different, but it's the same old problem.
Yes, ma'am, I would agree. And I'll tell you, you know, so we know with urban renewal grants, Jacksonville was a victim of that, right? Which helped with white flight. And they built 95 right through a viable African-American self-contained community. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I'm from, same thing. Chicago, all major cities. I moved here from Richmond, the exact same thing. And with a lot of promises about what was going to be developed after, right? They took the property via eminent domain and just displaced African-Americans. And those promises never came to fruition, you know? Well, and so, and I agree with you.
Is reconnect communities in the Biden bipartisan bill. There's a reconnect communities where they're going back in certain areas that they've already picked. And St. Paul, Minnesota is one, where I-94 went right through a Black neighborhood, disrupted the business community, and upset the family environment. That happened right here in Jacksonville with 95. When I came to Jacksonville, people were still running across 95 like they had a crosswalk.
Okay. Right. And I mean, and Ms. Thompson, that has happened in most major cities. I mean, and this is something the federal government did, you know, and with the promise of redeveloping and all these other things, but that never came to fruition. And I think that it's, you know, as you said, though, a lot of people are in survival mode, and that's real, because that social construct of race is not biologically real. It's a social construct that continues to have real world implications. But because of that, there's a direct correlation with that and social economic status because of past historical policies and practices, such as housing covenants and redlining. And, you know, and as a service-connected disabled veteran who buys my home every time with my VA home loan, had I come from World War II, I wouldn't be able to do that. And so we see the continued economic gap, and people will say, well, why can't those people pull themselves up by their bootstraps? So we still need people to get their foot up off our neck before we can do that. I mean, we know that discrimination still happens in the workforce if you have an ethnic sounding name, and I mean, so we see a lot of issues, and I think economics is one way to assist us, but I also think reality is that we do have, a lack of trust and transparency, and all of that is very real. And that's why in the report we talked about, a citizen review board, one where they would actually be held accountable. We also talked about recruiting from, Hispanic serving institutes, HBCUs, proud graduate of Albany State here, criminal justice program is where I was in, So, I mean, I think there are a lot of things that need to take place. And I'm with you. It's kind of exhausting because we have these conversations frequently and nothing tends to change.
I think we have these conversations because, power concedes nothing without a demand, never have, never will. I think that if you look at King and some of the ones that affected change, they had a community, the community, you had some that were afraid to stay back, but we've done forums in Jacksonville, jeans and tennis shoes, and you get, 10 people to show up. The NAACP, I think if you actually had meetings and the people that actually showed up and were willing to go to work is very few. I mean, so they see that, the people of power see that. So if we're not willing to fight for something, they'll assume keep their foot on their neck. So I think that conversations like this, we have about 15 of us on this platform tonight. These conversations are excellent conversations, but is, as I said before, the work of King, work of others, was folk actually came together. They saw not only Black folk, white folk. And that's one of the things that I took from George Floyd was, whereas Black folk believe, have seen or heard something like that happening before with law enforcement, you had folk in other countries were protesting about George Floyd. So it shocked the consciousness of a people. And I think that if the only time Black and brown kids see law enforcement is when they're coming in arrested, even if they're arresting the bad guy, taking the bad guy, if that's the only time I see you, it's like Pavlov's dog. I associate you with negative. So why would I want to be the police? And I think the community, if we're having a conversation or meeting about policing, what do you expect to police in your community? And only 10 people show up. The police think, well, maybe we're doing it right. Not folk aren't showing up. The faith community, there's a lot of pieces and places within the community got to stand up. It can't be just the Urban League. It can't be just the NAACP. It has to be a groundswell that we want better and we demand better. And I think that that's it. So I probably have fewer years left to live than I've lived. But the rest of them, we just got to make them count. Folks just got to stand up. I mean, I understand that in some communities, I can't tell who the folk in the community that's doing the drug dealing or this and that. They're afraid. And then they're distrustful of police. We got to find a place in a space that folk feel empowered, that I want my son and daughter to be able to go outside and play without having to duck from gunfire. At some point, we got to say that living in the life of our kids is more important than what I see in front of me here. Until we do that, I think these forms are needed and necessary, but I still think the jeans and tennis shoes going into the community and appealing to them like King did, that you got to have a stake in this. You got to want better for your community, because if not, what you get is what you get, because other people are benefiting from it.
And I want to add on to what Dr. Nelson just said, because so what we did with the Safer Together, it was via Zoom, and I completely agree with what he just said, because it was even on Zoom, and we intentionally had it different days, different times, even some on Saturday, and we would not get a lot of participation. Now, Take Them Down Jacks, the Northside Coalition, were constantly on the calls and at the meeting, and several other community groups. But the vast majority, we didn't have. And that's part of the issue, is we don't have the critical mass. And I will say, I agree with Dr. Nelson too, when other countries and our white allies saw what happened to George Floyd, that murder that we all saw, to me, it reminded me of the civil rights when our allies up north saw them release the dogs and the water hoses. They came right down and were like, oh yeah, this is not okay. You know, and so we have seen our allies, even when Black Lives Matter movement, you know, when they're marching, I've seen allies circle them to protect them because they know that their white body is, and to me, that says so much about our society, that they know that their white body and their privilege will protect us. And that is so problematic to me.
I'd like to follow up Dr. Hodo and Dr. Nelson. I've been in Jacksonville over 40 years, and you know, I've been involved somewhat with the police in terms of trying to make things better for our community. And I hear that so often that people need to get more involved. But it just seems that there's a system in place, especially here in Jacksonville, through consolidation. You know, we have a very large area here, 180 square miles that they're policing, and citizens seem to have come to grips with the fact that perhaps nothing positive will come out of engaging with the police because they have not seen many positive changes. It seems that, and this is just an observation, it seems that that oftentimes the police put up a lot of barriers. And it seems as though they have the answers. They want the system to continue to work as it's working. And there's a tendency to wait us out. You know, we tend to be reactive. You know, we do a lot of protesting in Jacksonville around various issues. But it seems that it's difficult to take that protest moment to actually gaining something positive, you know, and it seems that we're in a circle. We're in a circle and everyone is covering their own front and not very interested. And they hear a lot about community policing and how do you engage the community and the fact that maybe police should ride their bikes around in the community, knock on doors, you know, but it's, you can't knock on a door when you see a policeman at your door, you know, you're thinking the worst. So I'm rambling around, but do you have any thoughts on how we can just move the cheese? How can we accomplish something as opposed to just continuing to talk? I know we've got to talk. We've got to talk. But when do we get to a point where we see some definitive progress in some of these areas, whether it's policing or whether it's, you know, we had the situation with the cameras, okay? And so we finally got cameras. Now, you know, they're removing cameras because we're talking about the Murphy's Law or whatever. So it just seems that we're running around in circles and the police continue to do what the police does.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's starting at a block. I think that trying to do a whole zone, you know, they also have 6 zones, but let's start at a block and work our way out. Because like you said, if police officers knocking at your door, most times if you're black or brown, you think negative because that's the only time you see them. So if it's not like I see them any other time. It's kind of like I said, the only time you see the police is when they're coming in, make an arrest, then you associate them with arrest. So trying to create spaces and places that is not unnormal for you to see them, because they're there for non-enforcement action. The only time I see you is in enforcement. So one of the recommendations was just that law enforcement, and that's something you can measure. Now, the first couple of times they're going into a community saying, hey, my name is this, I'm here to, of course, folks gonna look at you, particularly black and brown, they're gonna look at you with a jaundiced eye. Who are you? I don't trust. Policing is like a marriage. You have to self-sacrifice. You have to communicate. Everything that it takes to make a marriage work, that's what it takes for policing, particularly community policing. Everything, all of that is that. Respect begets respect. If you come into a community, I'm the law, then you're gonna get what they give you. So we've been talking a long time. We've gone around playing this, but someone have to hold not only law enforcement accountable, but even the killings that someone holding folk accountable. It takes all of that. I see the good friend Ben Frazier on the line fighting the fight, but I'm saying I can name people in Jacksonville that's fighting the fight, but that's the problem, because I can name 15 or 20. You can't, King didn't win wars like that. So you need warriors that are going there and knock down the door, then you need ones to come back and build it back up and say, we're putting the door over here. But until that happens, Dr. Danford, it's gonna always be, we'll have these conversations about what we need to do. And others have a conversation about what do you want? So it's gonna continue to be, as you said, who moving the cheese to the benefit of who, and usually it's not the benefit of the community.
I have a question. Y'all have talked about how having these conversations are important, but on a more like policy related side, how important do you think it is to be voting in people who represent the true interests of the people of Jacksonville and can change policies? And do you think that we're even able to make change from a policy side, or should we be more focused on grassroots change?
I think policy is very important, but I also see the disenfranchisement of minority communities when it comes to voting rights. So we had Amendment 4, and I worked on that with many other people to get I forgot how many signatures we had to have in order to get it on the ballot. We got it on the ballot. The citizens said, yes, let's restore the voting rights of those who are returning citizens, because if they've served their time. And then we saw basically a poll tax attached to that, saying, well, if they have any fines or anything, they still cannot vote. I think policy is important. I think voting is imperative. I think that, as a community, we have fought long and hard to gain our right to vote, and we have to utilize that. But I also know that oftentimes we see that disenfranchisement. I mean, I think of a prime example to me, I think of the FAFSA form, right? The financial aid form everyone fills out for school. And if you're a convicted offender for selling drugs, you can't get any money to go to college. But if you're a pedophile or rapist, you can still get federal funds to go to school. So to me, that was very intentional, because when I think about the war on drugs and mass incarceration, and knowing 1 out of 3 African-American men will be under the control of the criminal justice system at some point in their life. Also, looking at policy, if you are a convicted drug offender, you can't live in public housing. And recognizing, again, that war on drug and the disparity between crack versus cocaine. I mean, so I think policy is important, but I also think, as Ms. Thomas spoke about, like the Voting Rights Act, why do we have to continuously go and have that? And we see in certain states that there are active legislative meetings taking place to, again, disenfranchise certain people. You can't give people water at the poll. I mean, just very tiny things that just tend to impede people's ability to have their voices heard. So I do think that policy is important, because then we can hold you to that. but we have to be able to actually be able to hold them to the policy if indeed they have violated it. And it doesn't need to be ambiguous. It needs to be very clear when they have violated something so that we can hold them to that.
Dr. Hodo, this is Deborah Thompson. I'm sorry, I just can't be quiet. Dr. Danford, please forgive me if I'm speaking out of line and tell me to be quiet if you wish.
I'm not going to do that.
Are we going to have anyone get their right to vote? We don't even have our right to vote. We still fighting to get the right to vote in Congress. The Voters' Right Act is on the table for chopping up. The Civil Rights Act is on the boat for chap. You know, we've got to really look at how these policies and procedures are put together. We don't even understand our own Constitution. I mean, we used to have an effort from the Urban League, from the city of Jacksonville, to teach average citizens what the Constitution is, what the Constitution of the state of Florida is. Some of these people are well within their rights to do exactly what they're doing, okay, by the law. So we need to look at what happens with our federal government, how it rolls down to the states that we are working in, and then to the city government. And I agree with Dr. Danford 100%. Until we get that, why would you put a neighborhoods bill of rights in place and then not endorse it, not have it go through administration by administration? And we say nothing because it's always another target that we're looking at. And we've taken our eye off the prize.
Well,
the
don't you think
is voter rights, the right for you to vote. We have voted. I mean, I was reading some of the old history, and Ben Frazier's on the line now. Ben, in one of the Alabama areas, people voted, and it was a man that got into an altercation at the voting site in Mobile, in Alabama in some area. I don't want to say Mobile because fact check me, but they shot him. And the people had to continue voting until somebody picked him up. And because we weren't able to get emergency vehicles, who picked him up? One of the Black funeral home guys had to come pick him up. That's who used to come and get us. Those were our emergency vehicles back in the day. I remember when in Jacksonville, Florida, we were fighting for taxes to get their, medallions, so we could have a Black taxi company to continue doing its work here. Ambulance companies. Black people have always wanted to do businesses in different areas. Okay, we used to have a Black ambulance company over on Edgewood, right off of Lim Turner. Ben, you from Jacksonville? Am I lying?
You're on mute, Ben.
Yeah. Yes, no, you're right. You're talking about Sharp ambulance service back in the old days.
Yes. Anybody remember Jay Baker and that group? Okay. Yep. To fight to try to get the right to run an ambulance service in the city of Jacksonville. Go get that 102-year-old Mr. Mitchell. Get him and let him tell you how when his sister got knocked down on an accident, that they had to go and get one of the Black funeral homes to come take her to the hospital. There were no emergency vehicles to help Black folk when they got in public spaces to be removed from the scene.
Right, and Ms. Thomas, I mean, I hear you, and I agree with what you're saying, and I do agree that we need to look federal, state, and then local, but we need people to actually get out there and vote. We should not have to continue to have this fight, but I do think that people who return as returning citizens, that recognizing 1 out of 3 African-American males will be under the control of the criminal justice system, that we do need to have them be able to gain their right to vote back as well, because that's going to help our cause. Too often our people are disenfranchised.
100%, but the poor can't help the poor.
Yes, ma'am. I agree. And like I said, we know there's a direct correlation, right, between that social construct of race and socioeconomic status. And that was very much intentional as well with federal policies and practices like we just talked about, urban renewal grants that helped with white flight and just came through and decimated, you know, viable African-American communities, you know, that were self-contained, that had their own banks, they had their own doctors, they had their own lawyers, dentists, everything. And freeways were just put right through them. And that was very intentional, you know, on state and city parts, you know, and we have not recovered. And it's just, I think we need a lot of action, but we need more people. It cannot just constantly be, you know, the 15 or 20 of us who have these conversations. So how do we get more people involved? I do see the younger generation, which does give me hope, because they do seem to be more actively engaged politically as well as civically. And Mr. Frazier, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, if I would please, allow me to commend you on a great report, which, by the way, I did read from one end to the other. Very good report. I'm looking forward to the meeting tomorrow at City Council in the George Morgan Safer Committee meeting. Dr. Nelson, we've worked with you and we're familiar. But let me explain to you what the major problem is here, folks. There is a tremendous lack of trust, transparency, and accountability. The sheriff has had an opportunity to correct this. He has not moved. Let's call it like it is. Orange Crush came here, and what did he do? Tell us he's going to make more room to put more Black people in jail. We had him writing tickets, jaywalking tickets, more to Blacks in the Black community than the Mandarin and the beaches. That was low-hanging fruit. He could have corrected it. What did he do? Crunched the numbers differently and said it wasn't really a problem. Here's what the problem is. These folks are crooks, Dr. Danford. They're saying the same thing that they've been telling us for years and for generations and several administrations. They are corrupt. We need to get rid of them. That is it. In a nutshell, get rid of them. They're giving us the same rehashed narrative since the days of JCCI in 2002 and earlier reports. We've gotten all the reports. They're mistreating Black folks. They're mistreating us in terms of policing. If they policed the Mandarin area like they do Grand Park and Moncrief, white folks would get their guns and start a revolution.
Well, I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. This is one of the reasons we're having these conversations at the Urban League, to learn and to engage the community and hear what they have to say, because it's our view that people aren't being listened to. And so we set out in a number of areas, including criminal justice reform, to set up a series of town halls. And these are all recorded, they're available on our YouTube channel. And they're here not only for us to listen to now, but in the future as we go forward. But clearly our goal is to have some positive results from these, rather than just, and I'll use the same words, JCCI it, you know, put it on the shelf and walk away. We don't want to see that happen. So I'm glad we have people here who are speaking up and letting us know their views, because it's really important to us. And I did want to circle back and thank Dr. Hodo and Dr. Nelson for speaking. I did have one question to Dr. Nelson, and that is, it seems like it's a good opportunity. What did you notice in, we had a small discussion when we first began the program before everybody had arrived. And both Dr. Nelson and Dr. Hodo had indicated they had read each other's reports, so they're, you know, reviewing them before the meeting. I'm just curious what each of you noticed. What stood out? Was there something, because to me, one of the ways to succeed in change is to look for the cracks. What is it that stood out in your mind, Dr. Nelson, when you looked at Dr. Hodo's report? And I'm going to turn around and ask Dr. Hodo the same question.
I think the same level of distrust. I think Ben speaks to a level of distrust that, whether rightly or wrongly, folk in the community feel that. And I think as a law enforcement profession, you serve all the people. So speaking to the needs of Ben, or speaking to the needs of folk in Mandarin, as a law enforcement professional agent, you have to speak to the needs of both. So that's what I took away from Dr. Hodo's report, from some of the conversations and the meetings that I've had within the community, is just the breadth and depth of the mistrust. And that, as I said before, if the only time Black and brown kids see law enforcement is when they're coming in, make an arrest, then their view of law enforcement is going to be such that I wouldn't want to be a law enforcement professional at a time where we need diversity in law enforcement, just like we need it anywhere else. So that was it for me. And the other takeaway from me is that there's work to be done. Anytime an agency or profession thinks that they've done everything and they're doing it all right, that's the whether it's the NAACP or whether it's the Omega Psi Phi, when we think that we're here, that's the time when you're not. And that's the same thing with law enforcement. And as I said before, it's power concedes nothing without a demand, never have, never will. And I think it is a place for everybody at the table, from Ben to President Thompson, to there's a seat at everybody for everybody at the table. That's where we have to come from that vantage point.
Dr. Hodo?
Yes, so with Dr. Nelson's report, which I thought was very, very good and very insightful, the similarities I saw, he talked about Citizen Review Board, about an oversight committee. He also talked about community engagement, actively being engaged with the community versus, again, not just coming when you're coming to arrest someone, but having that open dialogue and just engaging the community. And then the Citizens Review Board, or some type of oversight committee that is able to review policy and procedures and make suggestions, and having, again, that engagement with the community. It has to be a trusting, reciprocal relationship. And so that's what I gathered from his. And to me, when I read them, I mean, really, we could kind of combine them, you know, because they're really saying the same thing. And it's that lack of trust, which I hate to say, I think it's legitimate, you know, because again, if this is the only time, and I live in Mandarin, they're not over here, you know? And so, I mean, that lack of trust, the lack of transparency, you know, getting to know the actual neighborhood and the people that you're working with to protect and serve, and then having some type of oversight with accountability is what I gather. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A couple of things I will mention, and that is that on the tennis shoes on the ground, we have a community organizer for education, Felicity Price Forehand, who's laboring in the field in this regard and getting out and getting parents and leaders to focus on the needs of our children in the schools. So if anyone is interested in working with her, please drop me an email. It's dstone@jaxul.org. Would love to have you working with us. And that's not only for this audience live, but also if you catch this recording, please get in touch with us because we could use your help. And the other is, as part of our series on community engagement, we've had 2 meetings, one with leadership, one with talking about different models, and the third is a pilot program to demonstrate that one can engage the community, listen, and get feedback that would help us put resources where they need to be. And again, when we reach out to you to help us with that, we'd appreciate those of you who can and have the interest that you join us.
And Dennis, before we wrap up, do you think that we're going to get a citizens review board or something similar? I know we're working on it, and we pushed it, and Ben has been out there pushing it, and others, you know, and I'm talking about moving the cheese. Are we going to get a citizen review board or not? And if not, no. If so, then where do we go with that? Is a citizen review board really the issue? Is that really what we need in order to get us where we want to go? And, you know, either Dr. Nelson or Dr. Hodo or some of the other guests, participants, because I don't have a feel. I'm going to err on the other side. I don't believe until I see it that we will ever have a citizen review board. And I hope I'm wrong, Deborah, but unless it happens after Dr. Nelson's work here and Dr. Hodo's, you know, give me some hope here. Will it take real citizen engagement? What will it take? Help me out. Help me, Jesus.
Well, Dr. Hodo.
Keep hope alive, Doc. Keep hope alive.
Help me, Jesus. You call on the right one.
But Dr. Hodo, you came, I mean, your group, Safer Together, came pretty close to, and you had a great speaker from San Diego. And one of the interchanges I loved was she essentially said in a very tactful way, you either take it the way we've offered it, which is a advisory board, or do what's happened here, and we're bringing in subpoena power. So what's your choice?
Either you pay now or you pay later.
Right. It seems to me that your group was moving in that direction, and I'm hopeful that maybe you can't talk about it because some of this stuff is, I don't know, behind closed doors, but there any, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I say in our report on page 14, so COPS just came out with the evidence-based report that we were able to include about citizen review boards and some of the 13 principles for the effective citizen oversight of law enforcement, where they compared and contrasted the different methods used in different cities. And so we did include that. And council member Garrett Dennis is the one who introduced the bill. And I know that we're going to continue to have these conversations. The council and council members Boylan and Morgan are working to continue to have these Safer Together conversations to address some of the suggestions that we've made to include the Citizen Review Board, as well as additional resources for the co-responder program. So I think that I am hopeful. We had Dr. Poppy Finch, who sits on the Citizen Review Board in San Diego, came and spoke and gave a phenomenal presentation. And then we had Steve Zona from Jacksonville, a Fraternal Order of the Police, who is the president, who was against having one. But I agree with Dr. Finch, it's either kind of now or it's later, but reality is we have to have some accountability to create that transparency and that trust that minority communities tend to lack when it comes to policing because of historical and contemporary issues.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I would say one of the best ones that I've seen is St. Petersburg, Florida, as I think a progressive one. But once again, it was the community. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't just Miss Thompson and Ben Frazier. It was community. So whether Jacksonville gets one or not, I think is a community decision, and how well the community is willing to come forward and say, power concedes nothing without a demand, never will, never has, never will. And in this, most law enforcement agencies don't want a civilian review board because it's a mixed bag. You know, if I'm the sheriff and I'm doing this, then because civilian review, most folks think it's that you come in and you tell them how to operate but that's not what it is. So if you look at the different principles behind effective community policing, so some people, I mean, civilian review board, some people look at it and think it's one thing, and what it actually is something different. So there has to be a serious training on what it is, what's intended to be, and all that. And St. Petersburg understood the full gamut of it. So.
Well, that may be a good topic for a town hall at the Urban League to talk about, to do some training on what review boards are, to keep the eyes on the prize and moving that rock up the hill, as hard as it may seem. So thank you. Any other questions for our guests? Well,
this is Deborah again. I would just like to say that I know we may not have time, but I wanted to just applaud the young lady, Jacqueline Smith and Sophia Burger and Sebastian Singh for just being here and listening to us and understanding, hopefully, what we've been through, and to take some of the experiences and move forward with your life and your studies and your research, and help us move forward, because I think we're kind of stuck.
Thank you. As a matter of fact, they made this whole thing possible. And I did want to give a chance to Sophia to, as the MC of this meeting tonight, to sort of bring us to an end. So Sophia?
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody so much. I know this has been really informative for me. I'm sure it has been for everybody else. I love coming to these and listening to everything everybody has to say, and the opinions are great. I'm so glad we had a lot of questions tonight. I wanted to thank my fellow interns who made this possible. Couldn't have done it without them, and Mr. Stone for helping us all through the process. So thank you everybody for being here tonight.
Any last word? Thank you, Sophia, for all of your work and the work you've done for many of us at the Urban League, and as well as Jacqueline and Sebastian and all the interns. Richard, any final word?
Yes, tomorrow evening, I understand at 6:30, we, Dr. Hodo, your report will be presented at the council committee.
Yes, sir.
What is that? We're all invited.
Oh, yes, sir. Please, everybody come. We will be at City Hall tomorrow. We will be presenting our findings as well as making suggestions for moving forward, what type of sessions we think need to happen, and what changes we believe need to take place in Jacksonville in order to create that transparency and that trust.
Okay. So we have a little time left to send something out to the community. Hopefully we can get, I'm sure it's going to be live as well. So if you can't make it, then of course you can watch it on.
Unfortunately, Richard, the story I got today was that because of the governor's order, they are not doing live on technology, Facebook or otherwise. That's what. What's
going on in Florida?
Right.
Golly. Dr. Nelson, help us.
I wasn't going to throw that out there because things were bad enough. But
hey, Dr. Danford, we got to call on Jesus now. We can't have that. We're leading the nation. We're leading the nation in COVID, and yeah, it's Jesus. That's all we can call it, Jesus.
Yeah, they said we have Florida, we have more cases than 30 other states combined.
And including Botswana.
Oh, wow. We're very progressive here. Very sarcastic.
And Doc, we know, we left, finally, I wanted to just say we lost a supporter from the Urban League. I think that at Bethel Baptist Church, he'll be memorialized on Saturday. So, just another case of persons who come through there, and his son was a part of the youth group that came through the Urban League in years past, and he's being memorialized on Saturday at Bethel Baptist Church. So go read about that. They tell me it was on the news. I didn't hear it and see it.
Well, thanks again, everyone. And again, thank you, all of you who made this possible, our speakers and our audience who participated. Very, very grateful for your participation. Have a great evening and stay tuned.
Joy, take care.
Thank you.